Okay, let's talk about chords, scales, and keys. So first, chords. So we remember that a chord, by definition, is a group of notes, usually 3 or more. Sometimes you could call a sound that's just 2 notes a chord, but typically it's 3 or more. And typically it's stacked in these thirds. So if I'm only looking at white keys, we have 1, skip 2, 3, skip 4, and 5. So we have this 1, 3, 5 pattern. We're going to talk more about that in the next video a little bit. So this is a chord. Now remember, we have 2 main kinds of chords, and then a couple different kinds of chords. Our main kinds of chords are major and minor. The different ones that we looked at were like diminished. So major and minor chords. This is a major chord. Sounds nice and happy. I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to turn it into a minor chord. Remember, the only difference between a major chord and a minor chord is this middle note is down by a half step. That's a minor chord. So let's hear those two. So first the major and then the minor. This is a C major chord. This is a C minor chord. So you hear typically the minor chord has a little bit of a sad sound to it. So those are chords. We can have more notes in our chord. We could go up another step we would skip a note, and we're only looking at white notes here because we're in a certain key, which I'll talk about in a second. We'd skip one, and then we'd add another one. And then we can even go up farther. So this would be called a 7th. We could add a 9th. We could add a 13th. We haven't really talked about those yet. But if we do that, now we're going to get kind of jazzy sounding chords. That minor one doesn't sound great, but that's okay. The thing to remember, chords are 3 or more notes played together, and they can be major or minor, or on some occasions they can be these other ones, diminished and augmented is another one. Now a scale is a sequence of notes that are not played together necessarily, that we kind of use as a template. So for example, I'm going to write out the C major scale. Let's just do this. Okay, here is the C major scale. Now that sequence of notes we use as like a template to write music with. It can tell us what chords to make because it shows us all the notes we need to make chords in our pattern of every other note. But important to scales is that we don't write music very often, sometimes, by just simply playing scales. They don't have a huge purpose for using exactly out of the box, so to speak. Like you're not going to have a melody that sounds like this. Right? I guess what I'm trying to say here is we play with scales. They're like Play-Doh. Think of scales like Play-Doh. Here we go. So when you pull it out of the little tube or whatever Play-Doh comes in, it's just a blob, right? But it's got everything you need in it. It's the right color, it's the right consistency, it's everything you need. But you got to shape it. You got to do something with it. You just don't want to just like sit and stare at that blob, right? You got to play with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, let's maybe repeat that D note. Let's take this note down an octave. Let's do that again, and then that, and then that, and then throw another note at the end. So now I've used most of the notes of the scale, not all of them, and I've repeated some, but I've organized them in a way that might be musically interesting, more musically interesting than just playing them all in a row. Right? So I've made kind of a melody out of it. But the scale also tells us how to make chords, which we're going to talk about in the next video. Now the third thing here is keys. So what I'm trying to do here is get into your head the difference between scales, chords, and keys. So we know chords are 3 or more notes played together, usually. chords are derived from the scale, and the scale is derived more or less from the key. The key basically just means the scale. Let's go back to the scale. Oops. Okay, now we're back to a C major scale. The key means we're going to do a bunch of chords and a bunch of stuff that all uses that same chunk of Play-Doh. Like, we're going to work with that same chunk of Play-Doh for an extended amount of time, and that's going to make it all in key. In other words, dropping the Play-Doh analogy for just a minute, what we're going to do here is all the notes in a certain piece of music or a section of music are going to fit into this template. I'm not going to use any notes outside of this, or if I do, I'm going to use very, very few notes outside of this, and that means that it's going to be in this key. So the scale kind of works as the template for the key. So the difference between chords, scales, and keys. Chords are like the smallest in the amount of time that they get usually. We use a bunch of chords together to make a chord progression, which makes a song. Scales are how we derive our chords. Keys mean that we are sticking to a single scale for an extended period of time. We're going to be talking about all of those things in this class, and we're going to be talking about different kinds of them. We've looked at major chords and minor chords, and major scales and minor scales, and we've looked at major keys and minor keys. But there are a lot more than those two. Like, we've looked at major and minor, but there are a lot more, particularly scales. There are a lot more scales. And we're going to look at a whole slew of those. They each have a different kind of emotional quality. So it's some of them get really interesting, actually, what they convey, especially historic, from a historic standpoint. I'll try to spare you the big history lesson, but there are stories of some of these scales that we're going to be looking at being, well, there's one in particular that at a certain period of time in the history of humanity, if you played that scale, you would get your head chopped off. Like, literally. They would say, hey, that's the devil's scale, and so you must be the devil. So we need to remove your head from its shoulders because that scale was played. People took this stuff really seriously. Okay, let's move on and do a quick review of our diatonic chord progressions, this word that you must be sick of by now, and I hope you are, because it's that important. Quick review of that, and then we're on to some new stuff.